Thank you, Garrett.
You're welcome.
So anyways, what I was building to are two Supreme Court cases which kind of review this idea of whether or not the government has the authority to regulate the railroads. What were the two cases and what did they say? We mentioned two Supreme Court cases that address this issue. Tony, this is the happiest moment of my life that you know the answer to this question. Go ahead.
Munn versus Illinois.
Munn versus Illinois. Does anybody have a date on that in their notes? A date on that? Look at that. Yes, go ahead.
1877.
1877. Does anybody besides Tony remember the details of the case? What was that question in Munn versus Illinois, and how does that relate to our just recent conversation? Anybody recall that? Vit, do you recall Cassandra, do you recall the discussion? Megan, do you recall what was the question in Munn versus Illinois? Here's what, yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Government can regulate the roads.
Yes, can government regulate a private industry that they believe is in the public interest? I mean, can government just come in and tell a company that, look, you can't do this and you can't do that in terms of your rates and other stipulations of conducting your business? Because they argue that company or that industry is so important that it's in the public interest. And in the case of Munn versus Illinois, the government ruled just that, or the court ruled just that the government did have an interest, and they could regulate the rail rates for the public interest. Well, that's a pretty impressive ruling. That ruling is modified by the case of Wabash versus Illinois. Does anybody remember how it was modified? Because there's a question on the test about Munn versus Illinois and a question on the test about Wabash versus Illinois. Does anybody remember besides the instructor? The Wabash decision, we called it? Yeah, go ahead.
It set rates only if it crossed state lines.
Yes. In Munn versus Illinois, the decision was that states could regulate rail rates if they argued an industry, or they could regulate a private industry if that industry was considered to be in the public interest, like the railroads. In the Wabash versus Illinois decision, the court modified that to say that they could only regulate rail rates within the borders of their states. What piece of legislation was prompted by the Wabash decision? Basically, the Wabash decision said the only governmental body that can regulate the railroads effectively is the federal government. So if there was going to be a regulation of the railroads, it would have to be by the federal government. What piece of legislation was prompted by that decision, which we said was kind of anemic when it was passed, but far-reaching in its implications? Sarah, do you recall?
The Interstate Commerce Act?
The Interstate Commerce Act, 1887, was the first time that the federal government passed legislation that created a commission that would regulate a private industry, the railroads. Now, in class, we only talked about the railroads as being a catalyst to economic growth. But in your textbook and in Degler's reading, other things were discussed as well, like the richness of resources that were available in the United States, natural resources, the abundance of labor with immigration, the technological advances, and there's a question on the test about, you know, the other things that we didn't really talk about in class, but were mentioned in your book and mentioned by David. Now, we also talked in class that the economic growth that occurs in this time period is going to be centered around certain industries, and that individuals are going to build giant companies in those industries. And the two in particular, the three in particular that we talked about was the rail industry, you know, and how entrepreneurs built railroads and made vast riches. The steel industry, in which was dominated by Andrew Carnegie, who built the magnificent Carnegie Steel Company. And the oil industry, that was dominated by John D. Rockefeller, who built Standard Oil of Ohio. And there'll be a question or two on the test about, you know, these industries, the story of the people that built them. Carnegie, Rockefeller, and maybe something about Vanderbilt, who is the name that we associate the most with the rail industry. There'll also be a question on the test about how we view them. How do we view these great industrialists? Do we view them as great industrialists, or do we view them as robber barons? And why do we view them in the ways that we do? Right? Do we view these guys as great industrialists because they built enormous companies that promoted economic growth and prosperity and established a standard of living that we still enjoy to this day? Do we kind of focus on the prosperity that the United States enjoyed because of their success? Or do we look at how they exploited labor, in the case maybe of Carnegie, or what the injuries that occurred on the railroads, the exploitation, the safety problems, the environmental problems? Were they captains of industry, or were they robber barons? That kind of discussion, there is a question or two on the test about. What was the first billion-dollar company, and how did it come about? Did anybody recall, besides Vito and myself? The first billion-dollar company, how did it come about? What was it associated with? We talked about this. Go ahead, Vito.
I'm not sure I remember.
Son of a gun, Alexander.
J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel?
Yes. J.P. Morgan buys out Carnegie Steel, consolidates that company into U.S. Steel. It is the first billion-dollar company. Who do we associate the gospel of wealth with? Go ahead, Alan.
Andrew Carnegie.
What is the gospel of wealth? What did it involve?
It's a book by him.
Pardon me?
Isn't it a book by him?
Yeah, it was an article that he wrote, The Gospel of Wealth, but what was at the center of that argument? We really didn't talk, we made mention of this in passing a couple of times, didn't talk about it in detail. Go ahead, Amanda.
He was basically saying that wealth was a good thing.
Yes, that wealth was a good thing, and once you accumulated wealth, what was your obligation to do with it? Yes?
Give it back to society.
Determine how it might be best given back to society. And Carnegie exemplifies that when he builds all those libraries, right, and endows all those other things, where the great wealth that he amassed would be returned back to the common folk, right? Now, what's the difference between the gospel of wealth and social Darwinism? Who incidentally do we associate with, Austin, who did we associate, what British sociologist did we associate with social Darwinism? Do you recall? Go ahead, Janet.
I don't remember.
A bit of all people, yes.
Herbert Spencer.
Herbert Spencer. What American? Oh, this is a tough one. Yes.
William Graham Sumner.
William Graham Sumner that we talked. What's the difference between social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth? What, Tristan, did social Darwinism put forward?
If you're wealthy, that's good for you. Not, then that sucks.
Well, what the whispering Tristan said was, if you're wealthy, good for you, and if you're not, bad for you, right? You know, and although that sounds simplistic, it's kind of the essence of it, that wealth was the result of an evolutionary struggle between people in society. And those people who were successful and had the attributes that allowed them to succeed would in fact do so, and those people who didn't would not. So wealth and poverty were a natural consequence of an evolutionary struggle that was just there. And there was absolutely nothing anybody could do about it. And to attempt to do anything about rich and poor would hold society back. So that's a little bit different than the gospel of wealth. Carnegie really isn't fully, I mean, Carnegie buys the social Darwinistic kind of notion that you know, some are going to win and some are going to lose. But then this idea that he had an obligation to give back would be inconsistent with social Darwinism, right? That would be, you know, his twist on kind of wealth. Now, we talked about, you know, the growth of industry, the growth of big business. We talked about Carnegie. We talked about Rockefeller. We talked about the instability that occurred in the economy. And then we got into a conversation, a lengthy but interesting conversation, in how labor responded to all of this, right? And we talked about the changing nature of work. We said, look, One of the things that happens in the Gilded Age is industrialization, the factory, right? And the factory generates mass production and improves the standard of living of a lot of people, but it changes the nature of work, right? Workers become commoditized, right? You know, Degler's argument that labor is a factor of production to be added to the production process and withdrawn to the production process and then, you know, modified in the production process, dehumanized the worker. And it allowed for company owners to slash wages because that was just a component of production, to furlough workers, to make workers work in dangerous conditions. Those workers worked long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages, and then, to make things even worse, their conditions were unstable. At times, you know, the economy prospered and things went pretty well for them. At other times, the economy would decline and they would be furloughed, have their wages slashed, lose their jobs, you know, their standard of living would decline. And all of these things, you know, cause workers to respond by organizing, right? So we said, you know, the kind of acceleration of the labor movement, which involves forming individual unions in localities and then unions of unions that attempted to basically promote general labor goals, you know, was a response to the changing conditions of work. I mean, and that's kind of what Degler was talking about. You know, where did this labor movement come from? And the interesting thing, this is somewhat off topic, the interesting thing is the alternative to workers kind of just responding to the changing nature of work was that they aspired to kind of overthrow the system and change it with something else, the kind of radical notion. Right? And you know, the kind of the textbook and other things, and Degler lead, you say, well, look, no, these people are just like everybody else. They're responding to the instability, the uncertainty, the reckless nature of the era. Just like, you know, farmers responded by pushing, you know, the courts to provide stability with the railroads. Just like Rockefeller responded to the instability of the oil industry by forming a trust. Oh, incidentally, what word is synonymous with a trust? We say trust, yes.
Monopoly.
Monopoly, yes, okay. Now, in terms of the history of labor, you should certainly be familiar with the big two labor organizations, the Knights of Labor and the AFL. Who was, just for fun, let's see, who haven't we called upon it in quite some time? Taylor, just for fun, who was the leader of the Knights of Labor? It's not as much fun as I thought it was going to be, Taylor, but you, it's a nice name. Angela will help you. Yes, Terence Fowlerly is a nice name. He is the leader of the Knights of Labor, and what do we remember most about the Knights of Labor, and what might potentially be the most, dear Megan? Well, we remember the demise of the Knights of Labor is connected to the Haymarket Square riot. What was central to their ideology? What was central to Fowlerly's ideology? Go ahead, Vito.
They didn't want to strike.
Yeah, they didn't like to strike. Yes, they didn't believe in that. What did they believe in?
Kind of like a utopian socialist idea.
Yes, this idea of worker-producer cooperatives where workers would own the means of production, work for their own benefit. Remember how interestingly Degler tied that into his argument in the piece that he wrote? And this was considered to be, Jim, kind of radical, right? Although they weren't militant, Vito, they didn't want to strike, they weren't militant, their ideology was somewhat radical. And Megan, what leads to the demise of the Knights of Labor is that they are associated with the anarchists and other radicals that are a part of the Haymarket Square riot. How is the AFL? Oh, who is the leader of the AFL? Look at that, Alan put his hand up. Look at Alan, the hot piece. Go ahead, Alan. Gompers, he looked like his name, right? Samuel Gompers looked like his name. Samuel Gompers was the leader of the AFL. And how, Tori, was the AFL different from the Knights of Labor?
Wasn't it 4 strikes?
Well, they were more militant, and they were willing to swipe. Crawford, this is the happiest moment of my life. Go ahead.
I was going to say that they were militant.
Yeah, you like that militant part, right? I bet you they wore orange, right? You know, no, go ahead, Vic.
They were a union of other unions.
Yes, they were a union of other unions, and yes, it's good, you guys are smart.
They were like less inclusive, and they just like their philosophy was like they wanted more
Yes, they were less inclusive, they wanted more go, Crawford.
Did they only accept like skilled labor?
Skilled workers, so that they could shut down a particular skill and strike effectively. And most significantly, their agenda was considered to be conservative, right? You know, they didn't want to overthrow the system. They didn't want socialism or communism or anything like that. They, just as Jim said, wanted better wages, working conditions, lower hours, etc. Now, okay, so when we completed labor, we then went on to urbanization. And we talked about the push and the pull. You know, what pushed people off the farms and what pulled people into the city. What were the two big things that pulled people into Gilded Age cities? Said two big things. One, yes?
Economic opportunity.
Economic opportunity. And what was the other one, Tristan, besides economic opportunity? Pardon me? I'll call on Noah if I have to. Noah, go ahead. No, not, you're talking about immigrants. We're still talking about anybody. Yes, good. Yes, the lure of excitement of the city, Noah, the cultural activities that were in the city that would draw people there. So the two big pools into Gilded Age City were economic opportunity in factories and jobs that were related to factories, and the lure and excitement of the big city, that in contrast to what was happening on the farm. But we said the rapid increase in size of Gilded Age cities was certainly a function of people leaving the American countryside and going to the cities. But it was also very much a function of people leaving Europe in large numbers and coming to America, 80 to 90% of those people going to urban areas. That migration of people, or that immigration of people from Europe to Gilded Age cities, we said occurred in two waves. The first and the second, the old and the new. What was the difference between the first and the second, the old and the new? Janet, you love immigration. Who doesn't? Go ahead.
The first wave were more Northern and Western Europeans, and they were...
Yes, the first wave of immigrants were Northern and Western Europeans, right? They came in large number also, right? Therefore, the second wave, Tori, was who?
Like Eastern?
Eastern
Southern.
and Southern Europeans. How were these people different? You know, yes, go ahead.
The South was much more impoverished. The second wave was much more impoverished.
Yes, the second wave was poorer, yes.
They were usually illiterate.
Yes, illiterate. The second wave was poor people, illiterate people, kind of penniless peasants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Southern Italy, Eastern Europe. These people were leaving largely because of agricultural changes. They were peasants forced off their land. Now, what was pushing them? What did we say was at the bottom of this great second migration? Really, at the bottom of it was what? I mean, it almost goes back to the beginning of our conversation. The bottom of it. Go ahead, Jim.
Housing.
Go ahead, Sarah. I mean, you know, what was the first thing we talked about today? First thing. First thing. Go ahead, Kevin.
Industrialization.
The railroads, right? So the railroads were the first thing we talked about, right? So, okay, if that's the first thing we talked about, what did the railroads do? Open land to cultivation. And that land that got open to cultivation resulted in these huge farm surpluses. And these huge farm surpluses resulted in declining farm prices. And those prices declined so far, the U.S. agricultural revolution was so far-reaching that peasants in southern Italy, or peasants in Lithuania, or Poland, or other places, no longer could viably cultivate that land. Landlords were kicking people off. These people were leaving in large numbers. Because of improved technology, they were able to make it to cities in Europe. Because of better steam technology, they were able to make it to America. Because of better communications, they could be more, easily recruited into places like railroads and steel factories and other places. And so it all coalesces in this second great wave of migration that comes in, that includes all of these lesser educated people who are more culturally different, more religiously different, more economically different, more politically different than any other group of immigrants that had ever come here. Even the Irish, who were impoverished, still had English language speaking skills, right? You know, so this second wave is interesting. What was a bird of passage? Yes, go ahead.
Were there the people that just came to make money and go back to their
It
homeland?
went back, in some cases, 25%. What Alexander said, a bird of passage was somebody that migrated here, came here to make money, and wanted to go back, interestingly enough, to buy land. What was a nativist? And how did the nativists connect to the immigrants? Alan?
Natives are people who like are Americans and
For who?
America.
Americans for Americans. Hey, listen to this, Vito. A nativist is Americans for America, America for Americans. Just like the Boxer Rebellion that we talked about today was Chinese for China, or China for the Chinese, America for the Americans, right? And they saw these huge influx of what they considered to be inferior people coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe and feared them. Right? They feared them, so they ignored them. They were hostile to them. Nativism, the American Protective Society, among other organizations, were set up to somehow limit immigration. Right? And what was the first immigrant group that was actually limited? I don't even know if this was in this unit. It was somewhere in here. The first immigrant group that was actually limited were not Europeans. Chinese, yes, the Chinese. And I think that was as early as like the 1880s. I should know that. I'm a professional educator. I should know more. Now, when all these people streamed into Gilded Age cities, all of these immigrants, particularly in that second wave of immigrants that come after the 1880s, when all these people, flock into these cities, there are no social services for them. They are penniless, uneducated, illiterate, sometimes unskilled people that flock into cities in large numbers and live in horrible conditions in urban slums. And they are chronicled by Jacob Riis. What was the name of Riis's book that he wrote? I mean, this is just something that you should know. I mean, this adage, Riis coins this term. What was the name of the book that he wrote? Does anyone know besides myself and Cassandra? Cassandra, you do not know. Oh, then it's just me then. Yes. How the other half lives, right? And we said that on the national level and on the state level, and even amongst churches and others, there wasn't much interest in providing any kind of services to these people that were flocking into cities. So, given that, what group or what entity provides basic social services for the impoverished immigrants that flow into these cities? Yes. Yes, the big city political bosses. And what political boss did we name by name? The only one, Alan. What city was he in? New York City. His political machine was called Tammany Hall. And remember, the political bosses provided some level of social services. Now, it's interesting. I was listening to my favorite radio station, NPR, right? Not that music you kids, but NPR. I was listening, and there was an author on there who had just written a book on Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, and one of the things that he argued was the very thing that we are arguing now, that the political bosses provided basic social services to the immigrant poor that flocked into those cities. And in return for those basic social services, right, the immigrant poor registered and voted the way the boss wanted them to vote. So these bosses kept control of these cities as long as nobody else was doing anything. And we said the reason that people didn't want to do anything about the immigrant poor is they thought they were poor because of who they were. In other words, they were poor because of their ethnicity, their what they considered to be their race and ethnicity, their language, their religion. They were poor because of their personal habits, alcohol consumption. They were poor because of their lack of education and intellect. They were poor because of who they were. And remember, we said that people that took that position were unwilling to do anything about their poverty, whether they thought they were poor because they were sinners. Their faults. And so we said that this, as long as that notion persisted, and as long as the solution to poverty in the cities was either temperance, keeping alcohol away from these people, or immigration restriction, the political bosses maintained power. But eventually there were certain groups that emerged that began to say, hey, maybe these people are not poor because of their personal failings. Maybe they're poor because of the circumstances that they find themselves in. And one group, we said, were advocates of the social gospel. Does anybody remember even one name of someone who was an advocate of this? Yes?
Adams with the two Ds.
Well, yes, she was an advocate of the social gospel. She is best known of Jane Addams for the Settlement House movement, right? Walter Rauschenbusch and Washington Gladden both are ministers that we associate with the social gospel. Now, to kind of wrap up, right, our conversation about urbanization, and what we did in our discussion of urbanization, we said, okay, what is the push of the pull? How does that happen? What about the immigration that comes over? What about the immigrants? How does that kind of color the city? How does that relate to, the problems of poverty, how the other half lives, the big city bosses, and eventually the response of churches with the social gospel and the settlement house movement. Then we talked about how urbanization affected culture and life, right? And we talked about some things. One of the things we talked about is the intellectual response to poverty and wealth. And we said that most of the intellectual response involved social Darwinism, kind of accepting things as being evolutionary. But there were some dissenters to that. And 3 of them are all on your test. The 3 that we talked about were William James. What was he known for? Does anybody besides the instructor remember? James was known for pragmatism. Pragmatism was this idea of what is true is what works. That there isn't this kind of static evolutionary truth. What's true is what works. Henry George, what was Henry George known for? What was the name of his book? Go ahead, Rachel. Poverty in Progress, 1879. What was he known for, Sarah? It's a trick question, I know that. Yes. Go ahead, Alan.
Single tax?
The single tax, right? Arguing the surplus value of rent was unfair and should be socialized. And Edward Bellamy. What was Bellamy? What was the name of his book? Yes? Looking backward. Where he argued for a government takeover of all the private industries. There's also something on the test about something called the Morrill Land Grant Act that you might want to take a look at. The Morrill Land Grant Act. There's a discussion in your book about higher education. And the Morrill Land Grant Act is a part of that, so take a peek at that. Now, that takes us into kind of a conclusionary discussion about imperialism. Almost everything that I've talked about regarding imperialism, all the way up until today, there's at least one question on it. So every big topic that we talked about, right, including the impulses of imperialism, the impulses of expansionism. Remember I put on the board expansionism, imperialism, and I talked about some of the impulses that led into it, Christian missionary zeal, economic factors, the Depression, ideology. One I mentioned was the Turner thesis. What is the Turner thesis? I think there might be something on the test. Emily, do you remember the Turner thesis? You do not. Kaylee, do you remember the Turner thesis? Frederick Jackson Turner. Go ahead, Alan, tell the kids. Blasted. Alan, the Turner thesis. Sarah, go ahead.
That we were going to become Europeans unless we found like a new frontier.
Wow, that's a nice explanation. What Frederick Jackson Turner said is we will in fact become like Europeans if we don't find frontiers to conquer. Because that's what made us Americans, conquering the frontier. So if we don't find additional frontiers to conquer, then we will in fact be like the Europeans, right? And so this justifies expansionism, because the frontier closed in 1890. Who was Alfred Thayer Mahan? Yeah, go ahead.
He's the guy that said we should have a strong Navy.
Yes, he advocated for a strong Navy. Anybody remember, besides Tristan and myself, the name of the book that he wrote? Go ahead, Tori.
The influence of sea power upon history.
Yes, The Influence of Sea Power Upon World History is the book that Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote. In that book, he promoted this idea that every great nation, every great empire in human history was a great naval power. And that if the United States wanted to fulfill its destiny as a great nation, that it had to build its navy up as well. And so remember, Mahan is kind of the intellectual foundation of jingoism. The Jingos were these militaristic expansionists that wanted to build America's navy and to expand its influence in the world, even if that meant the acquisition of colonies. Now, we said with this kind of new attitude about America's position in the world that emerges in the mid-1890s, America almost gets into a number of disputes. The most important dispute that they do get into is the Spanish War. But there is a discussion in your text about something called the Venezuela border dispute. That's also significant. We almost engage in war with Britain over some disputed territory in Venezuela. So take a look at that. There's also a push to annex Hawaii. When was Hawaii annexed? During what time? Anybody remember? It was annexed during the Spanish War. But there was an attempt to annex it before that. And actually it's Cleveland that stops it from being annexed prior to the Spanish War. It's only after McKinley takes office that it is annexed. And then we said, well, okay, look, this kind of militaristic jingoism, this expansionistic sentiment that coalesces together and almost results in a conflict between the United States and England over Venezuela does in fact explode into war over Cuba. And remember, the issue in Cuba is that we see the Spanish as repressing the poor Cuban people, and there is kind of a shift in public opinion to intervene on behalf of the Cuban people in order to kind of protect the values of humanity and to assure that they can govern themselves. And McKinley is kind of swept along by this. We say that McKinley resists this for a while, but eventually the political pressure is such on McKinley that he's forced to kind of, well, I don't want to say he's forced, he feels compelled to ask Congress for the authorization to use force in Cuba to liberate the Cubans. What's the big thing that really pushes the tide of public opinion? Go ahead. Yes, the sinking of the Maine. What was the Teller Amendment, Angela? And how does that relate to what we're talking about? Sinking of the Maine, intervening in Cuba. Dear Angela, the Teller Amendment. Yes, the Teller Amendment is what we call veto self-denying. We will not take Cuba as a colony as a result of it. Oops, that's okay. Now, so the Teller Amendment is self-denying, but what's the Platt Amendment? What's the relationship between the Platt Amendment and the Teller Amendment? Yes.
The Platt Amendment, like, you'll be free, but you got to live by our code of rules.
So the Platt Amendment comes after. The Teller Amendment comes before. Both of them deal with Cuba, right? The Platt Amendment, is rules that the Cubans have to incorporate into their constitution. The Teller Amendment says we won't take you as a colony. The Platt Amendment says we won't take you as a colony, but you must follow these rules. Right? Now, we said that the Spanish-American War breaks out when the United States decides that it's going to intervene on behalf of the Cubans. Spain declares war against us, we declare war on them. And, eventually the main theater of the war is going to be Cuba. And although we kind of easily take Cuba, American forces don't perform necessarily well there. There are some engagements, but the Cubans, or the Spanish almost kind of, fight just long enough to keep their honor. And on the ground, American forces don't have tremendous success. On the seas, they do. On the seas, they take, the Philippines kind of easily. They defeat the Spanish flank in Santiago Harbor. But on the ground, they have limited success, and they are plagued by disease and mismanagement. Right? Nevertheless, you know, we do take Cuba, we do liberate the Philippines. And who is I mentioned this guy, who is the Filipino insurrectionist that they brought back to the Philippines, who assisted us in fighting against the Spanish? Yes? Emilio Bonaldo. Okay. Now, once the war was over, the big controversy was over the Philippines, whether or not to annex it. We talked about that at length over the past couple of days. That was the big discussion. Do we annex the Philippines or not? Now, we said that McKinley ultimately is going to decide. How would you characterize McKinley's decision to eventually annex the Philippines? On the basis of what? How would you describe it? Go ahead, Meg. Yeah, you know what I would call that, Meg? When Megan said there was no other option, I would say on the basis of practicality. What other kind of practical thing can we do? And the Senate and the public kind of confirm that. But there is this anti-imperialist sentiment, right? And the anti-imperialist league, and we talked about that at length. Give me two reasons why the anti-imperialists opposed the annexation of the Philippines. Two reasons. Go ahead, Kevin, give me one.
They went against the spirit of why the U.S. was founded.
Dear Kevin said that it was contrary to the spirit of why the United States was founded. Basically the idea of government by the consent of the governed. Give me another reason. That's the big one we mentioned. Give me another reason. Any other reason? Yes, go ahead, Megan. Yes, it will embroil us in kind of Asiatic problems. We'll have to protect them. You know, you'll be bringing in inferior race of people in. They'll compete with organized, with organized labor and lower jobs. How did the Filipinos respond to our annexation of them? Go ahead, dear Alexander.
They insurrected.
Yes, there was the Filipino insurrection, which we spent money and troops and lives to put down the Filipino insurrection. Now, we talked today about the aftermath of the Spanish-American War and the Filipino insurrection. What we discussed was, Theodore Roosevelt's ascension to office. Why do I say ascension to office rather than election to office, dear Cassandra? McKinley was elected in 1900, and what was Roosevelt's relation to McKinley? He was his vice president. So when McKinley was assassinated in 01, Roosevelt ascends to the presidency, right? Now, what's the open door in China? What's the bottom line to the open door in China?
Wasn't like you always believe in free trade in China?
Yes. Very nicely put. There's a question that asks basically that simple question. What's the essence of the open door? What do we in essence want in China? Free and fair trade. And we see that best accomplished as China being a free and independent country. Not free domestically, but free from colonization. Right? An independent, sovereign nation. So we are committed, and how we define that is the territorial integrity of China and free trade within the Chinese Empire, or whatever territorial area that it was accomplished. So we talked about that, and we mentioned the Boxer Rebellion, right, as being an opportunity for America to assert the second open door notes, which kind of really specifically defines our position in China. And then we concluded by talking about the construction of the Panama Canal. Hey, what two routes were really in play for the Panama Canal? Go ahead, Carl.
Through Panama and then through Nicaragua.
Nicaragua or Panama. And the Panamanian route is chosen. And eventually, the deal with... How does Panama become an independent country? Right? I mean, yeah, go ahead, Alan.
The Colombians don't want to do the deal, so they start, after the Panamanians want to have another revolution, Colombians try to get there, but U.S. ships block them.
So the United States maybe either tacitly or directly contribute to a revolution within Panama to revolt from Colombian rule, and then quickly recognize the Panamanian government and negotiate a treaty that allows for a canal zone, and then they build a canal. Is that what happened? It seems like that's what happened. And the Colombians didn't like it very well. There's also something on the test called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And that dealt with, a corollary means an addition to, or an extension of. And it actually dealt, the Roosevelt-Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, dealt with Latin American debt problems. What happens if Latin American countries get into debt trouble and European countries come a-collecting? Right? What Roosevelt proclaimed to the world is, if a Latin American country is in debt problems, rather than allowing Europeans to intervene directly, those European nations had to come through the United States. That we are the policemen of Latin America. Roosevelt also won the Nobel Peace Prize, and you should read about how he did. And that would be the last question on your examination. Right? Roosevelt is the last topic. Okay, all right, that's it for, hopefully this will be, part of this will be on the YouTube tonight. Otherwise, thank you very much.